I'm going to present on gender-based violence. And most of the times, I'm equally an advocate for men as well. So most of the times, people, when they hear about gender-based violence, they are aligned to think that it's in favor of women. You see the statistics that it's not always in favor of women when I go to the statistics. The outline of my presentation will look at the definition of key terms, and the reason why I'll spend a bit of time unpacking the key terms is because at times we confuse these terms, gender, sex, and the related issues, equity, equality, all that. I'll spend a bit of more time around that, such that when we get out of this discussion, we're very clear on the differences between those things. So I'll equally speak to the difference between sex and gender, or sex versus gender. We'll look at that. We'll define gender-based violence now as the systematic process. We'll also speak to the types of gender-based violence, of which most men are subjected to. And we'll also speak to, we'll get a sense of the GBV statistics globally and equally in the country. We'll look at the roots of gender-based violence, and then we'll look at the scope of gender-based violence, and of course, ways of dealing with GBV. And I'll start with this slide. Is this, do you see this slide? So there is equality here. Then reality is not really coming out well. How do we reposition the... Yeah, we might have to adjust that. So this is equality, right? Can you see equality? Right? Is equality equity? This is equity, right? Can you see equity? Right? And this is reality. Do you see the reality? We want to compare the three as if, I hope the projector can be able to be adjusted so that we actually see the three. Because we'll go back, after the presentation, we'll equally have a similar slide, such that we reflect back on this after the presentation to have a sense of whether we have equality, equity, and reality. And what reality tells us about equality and equity. All right? So this is the eldest, right? And this one is the one that comes after this one, and this one is the last one, right? So here we're talking about equality. And there, it's equity, because remember, there's a barrier here, and they want to see what is happening there. So there is equity there. But where there is equity, there is no equality, right? But there's no stool at the same time to take you up. But look at reality. So we'll go to the definition of key terms. The slides are a bit packed. I tried to put in all the definitions so that at least we are very clear. So gender, it is widely shared ideas and expectations concerning men and women and how they should behave in various situations. So it is to do with behavior, right? But it speaks to men and women. But as they behave in different situations, they are usually defined by geographic or cultural context. So the reason why I bolded and even put the red color under cultural, it has a significant bearing, gender has a significant bearing to culture within a given context. And you'll see when I then get to the definition of gender norms and cultural norms. Gender equality, on the other side, is freedom of both men and women to develop their personal abilities and make choices without limitations set by predefined stereotypes, gender roles, and prejudices. The different behaviors aspirations, and needs of both men and women are considered. This is gender equality. And they are valued and favored equally, and the rights and responsibilities and opportunities of a person are not dependent on whether they are born male or female. This is gender equality. All right? Remember the previous session, which was speaking to men exclusively. So now we are balancing this discourse within the context of gender equality. Previously, just after the Beijing conference, when people came back, they just thought gender equality was about women. It's not. Gender equity, it is the fairness of treatment for men and women according to their respective needs, right? Gender equity leads to gender equality. We'll go back here. So gender equity leads to gender equality. But key points to remember around these definitions is there is a generally accepted value or norm. A generally accepted value and norm can become part of a people's culture. Remember when Dr. Nkosana talked about, gave us an example of that girl who comes from another culture or another area, but then went to another area. So there is the aspect of a norm or a value. But that then is linked to culture. Because when that girl went to the other side, they thought that girl was disrespectful, right? But within their culture, it's actually respectful. So there is, again, the issue of norm or value within the context that you are in culturally. So then that's where we then hear about gender norms. And they are defined by the culture. So culture is such dimensions as ideas, ways of thinking, norms, accepted ways of carrying out ideas, and material culture, which are patterns of processing or using the products of culture, e.g., for example, tools or traditional medicine. So culture is not homogeneous. It is naturally dynamic and changes with the needs of the community or society. So that's culture. So we want to relate culture to gender equality and equity. I hope we're still on the same space. We also want to look at sex vis-a-vis gender. So girls are often taught to behave in a different way from boys to boys. Am I right? So sex is determined biologically. The previous presentation is a clear testimony to this, right? So sex is determined biologically, but gender refers to the social role the culture and community impose on individuals. Sisong, are we on the same page? So the sex of a person is biological and fixed, but gender is imposed by society and can change. So sex is what we are born with, while gender is how society says we should behave based on our sex. Are we there? So as communities and cultures change and grow, so do the rigid expectations of how we should behave based on our sex. The behavior of men and women is socially developed and not determined biologically. In this way, the culture in which boys and girls grow up with differing opportunities offered to each determines their quality of life. Right? We're still trying to tease out the terms so that when we then get into gender-based violence, we are very clear on what then is gender-based violence and who then is perpetrating gender-based violence. And it becomes easy for us to engage and manage gender-based violence. So, what is GBV? So gender-based violence, given the context that I started off from, the definitions that I wanted to put you in the picture, so that when we then discuss gender-based violence, we are very clear. Gender-based violence is any harmful act that is perpetrated against a person's will, and that is based on socially ascribed, and these are gender. Remember, gender is determined socially. So socially ascribed differences between males and females. This is UNFPA definition. But immediately after the Beijing conference, it wasn't saying persons, it was saying women's will. But the proper definition is it's taking care of both sexes, right? So GBV is seen as a development issue with severe consequential impact on social and economic development. So in terms of statistics, 32.5% of females and 8.9% of males aged between 18 to 24 years had experienced some form of sexual violence prior to reaching age 18. 1 in 2 women without education experiences spousal violence. That's according to NFPA, based on the 2017 assessment. And spousal violence is intimate partner between these two spouses. 27% of women aged 15 to 49 reported that they had experienced sexual violence at some point in their life. That's according to the Zimbabwe Demographic Health Survey. In Zimbabwe, about 1 in 3 women aged 15 to 49 have experienced physical violence. 1 in 4 women have experienced sexual violence since the age of 15. It's still in Zimbabwe. 1 in 4 women has been abused during pregnancy. Remember our discussion around early childhood stimulation, right? 39% of women who have experienced physical or sexual violence have sought help. Remember the discussion around help-seeking behavior. 39% sought help. So which means, what happened to the 61%? They didn't. Why? And some of the reasons are, it's my spouse, right? So, or it's my breadwinner, or it's this or that. So if I go and report the breadwinner, then... In case of domestic violence, such as wife beating, about 58% is wife and husband beating. It's not just wife. But these statistics are specifically for wife beating. So about 58% of women felt that a husband is justified in beating a wife if she commits infidelity, while the proportion of men who felt the same was lower. This again according to the Zimbabwe Demographic Health Survey. So this is saying 58% of women felt that it was fine for a husband to beat me up if I commit infidelity. And these women were actually saying, we are fine with that. It's fine. We are okay. Globally, at least 1 woman in 5 will be a victim of rape or attempted rape in her lifetime. The toll of violence on women's health exceeds that of traffic accidents and malaria combined. Violence kills and disables the same number of women between the ages of 15 and 44 as cancer dies. Cancer does. More than 130 million girls have been subjected to female genital cutting worldwide. In Zimbabwe, this is not as big, but there are a few pockets that do female genital cutting. Mutilation, yes. 800,000 people are trafficked across national borders, and millions more are trafficked within their own countries. We had an exercise last year where we participated in bringing back a couple of our own Zimbabweans who had been trafficked to Kenya. And when I had an interface with them in Kenya, it was really pathetic and sad, because the advert that was shared in Zimbabwe was as if it's an opportunity to work in a hotel and in hospitality and tourism and hospitality industries in Kenya. And they were given free air tickets, and everything else was provided for. And then when they went there, their passports were withdrawn by those that had facilitated trafficking, and then they were introduced to, it's a hotel, but the activities that are happening there are not hotel in nature, so it's more of a strip club. And then they were then taken to work as bartenders, right? And then when they graduate, they are graduated because they are started on drugs and the different, so that they have that addiction, and then the minute they have addiction, they are elevated to become strippers. It was a sorry and a sad situation, to an extent that because of that drug addiction, some of them refused to come back home, and the embassy in Zimbabwe continued, the Zimbabwean embassy in Kenya continued to engage in that discussion. But this is happening on a daily basis. So it then becomes important that as opportunities are unveiling themselves, and remember we are kind of marginalized in the country, and we think an overseas opportunity is a good opportunity, but you then realize that our children, both male and female, are struggling out there, and they are getting into things that are not proper. And even closer home in South Africa, get to Sandton. If you are booked in those high-level hotels that are close to Sandton, if you're going towards Nelson Mandela Square, if you would find ladies there who say they are actually providing massage services, right? If you engage those ladies in Shona, you will hear them speaking Shona, and you think they have a massage parlor, and yet they want to provide different massages in your room. So it's important that we also get to manage the things that are happening outside the country. 80% of transnational victims of trafficking are women and girls. And I was just relating the issues. So these are the statistics by province, a couple of statistics of women's experience with spousal, physical or sexual violence by province. Midlands is at 39%. Masvingo is equally represented here, 40%. Some of Vitori, they are slightly higher than Midlands. The lowest is Matebeleland North, and the highest is Mashonaland Central in terms of percentage of ever married women aged 15 to 49 who have experienced physical and or sexual violence committed by their husband or partner. So how many types of GBV do we have? We have 4 types of gender-based violence. So the number 1 is physical gender-based violence. This provides physical affliction. So it hurts the body, and it can be seen because it leaves wounds, it leaves scars on the body. So that's physical violence. We have emotional violence. So physical violence, if you see the statistics, it affects more of women, right, than it does to men, but it also affects a bit of men. But the one that affects men more, we'll get into that, is emotional violence. So emotional violence hurts feelings. But during the premarital stage or the courtship or before the courtship, women are more affected by the emotional violence than men. Why is that so? Why? Why do women get affected by emotional GBV as when they are still young and getting into courtship and even younger? Women don't want to share why that happens. Then the third one is sexual. it controls the elements around sexuality. So sexual gender-based violence also happens when in the morning, doc presented in the morning, there's lots of them, and the woman is not prepared for the next 2 weeks to provide a service. Then it becomes sexual violence, sexual GBV. It equally affects the emotional part as well. Because the man then goes to work emotionally charged, and it will be fireworks at work. Everyone who comes into the office can be something else. The response can be something else. So that's the reason why you then realize. I participated in one workshop where we had a lawyer, a lady trainer, and she was speaking about emotional GBV. And she was saying, I can look around this room and check on how many women last had sex in the last 2 months. I can see because their face will be looking cheeky. I don't know how far true that is. But that is a bearing on sexual gender-based violence as well as emotional gender-based violence. Then there's the economic gender-based violence. So economic, it controls access to money, property, and resources. So that's the economic type. So what are the roots of gender-based violence? When society or self assigns a lower status to one sex. Remember when we had a discussion on stigma and discrimination. Remember when we talked about self-stigma and what it does to one's esteem, self-esteem. When it lowers that self-esteem, then you are more prone to gender-based violence because you don't feel confident enough to stand for your rights. You don't feel confident enough to relate and communicate and ensure that you resist any form of gender-based violence. So GBV is usually perpetrated by people who feel they are of a higher status, men to women, or women who feel superior to men because they have a better paying job, because they have a better position, because they have a better stature. And we have a serious challenge in Zimbabwe currently because lots of industries closed and quite a number of men are currently not working, and we have more of emotional gender-based violence. Because already the man feels in terms of gender roles, the man is supposed to provide for the family. Right? But because the man is failing to provide for the family, he is now the one that's at home, and then the woman is the one that's working, and maybe the woman is a teacher, the woman is a nurse, the woman is a different type of a health professional, and comes back home, and the man is sitting under a tree. Right? So automatically, self-esteem is lowered. But because self-esteem is lowered, then there can be emotional tossing and instructing. GBV is accepted by those who see themselves as having low self-esteem. So it goes back to self-stigma. So the minute you then say to yourself, you have low self-esteem, then you have a challenge. Then GBV comes in. GBV comes in because of infidelity and polygamy. There's also gender-based violence. Commercialization of lobola, or the bride price, also brings in the element of GBV. And how? Is because the one that is paid feels they own the person that they paid. You get the sense? So that element of ownership then comes into the picture. And yet, a woman is not a wardrobe. Commercialization, again, economic factors such as poverty, exploitation, access to and control over resources is equally another root cause of gender-based violence. And one case in point was when the land discussion happened, it was more of to men than to women. But at the same time, it's equally important that we manage the discussion around property and ownership. Most of the title deeds belong to, I'm continuing with roots of GBV. Variance between the modern and traditional or religious conceptions of love by men and women. So there are variances in terms of the modern love vis-a-vis the traditional love. So remember, if you go back to the statistics, there's a percentage of women, 58%, who said, it's fine for me to be beaten, right? And if I had gone further with unpacking some of those statistics, even not just for infidelity, even just beating, because I'm a woman, I should just be beaten, they were fine by it in terms of statistics. So what it then means, there is a difference between their traditional perception of love versus the modern perception of love. Though the modern perception of love is equally being affected by our social media, where in the house the men will be holding their cell phone this side, and the men and the woman this side, and the children that side, and then we lack that stimulation that's required in the home. Harmful traditional practices. Their children, the girl child, is still being pledged for purposes of appeasing, avenging spirits. Do you know that? This is still happening in Zimbabwe. Yes. Kuri pangozi nemwanasikana. Otoendeswa onza arikudi. So, girl child is being pledged for purposes of avenging or appeasing, avenging spirits. Forced marriage, we still have forced marriages. We still have child marriages. We still have forced virginity testing and forced wife inheritance. And this all increases women and children's vulnerability to violence. It is equally facilitated by masculinity and patriarchal society. So this goes back to the reason why we wanted to define gender and then sex versus gender. So there's that component of gender roles where there's the element of masculinity because I am a man. So because I'm a man, I'm masculine. I'm able to do anything. And there are young ones who are dancing the tune of good exercise, but then when they go to the gym, they want to become macho. So they are working with masculinity. And at times we perpetrate that as especially mothers, but I'm not blaming mothers. When your young boy comes back home crying and has been beaten by another boy, what normally do you say? Go back in Unomuroa. Urimurume. Do we say that? Eh? And what are we pushing in them? What are we telling them? We're telling them that you are masculine. Right? And we also do that in depending on the culture. We then say kunana chiera, right? Chiera aunganotongwa nemurume kana waenda ukoko. So the house then becomes like Chiera's house. It's because they come from Buhera, and they cannot then when they go there, they are the owners of the house. But what are we doing when we are saying those things? We are creating that masculinity, and we are equally creating a patriarchal and a matriarchal society. So the patriarchal is the more controlled and equally vice versa. So we are equally creating social hierarchies, and they become natural acceptance of violence as a mode of social interaction and political interface. So by socio-economic inequality and a breakdown in norms and social structures. So we need to manage that, because as we're doing that, as they are growing up, they think that that's it. So I'm masculine. So if anyone threatens me, I'm supposed to beat that person up. Right? So already that component of violence is being ingrained in the toddler's mind. Again, limited participation of women in decision-making processes is also one of the roots of gender-based violence. But at times, this also goes back to women. At times, women push for a bigger piece of the cake, but then when it comes to voting, women will be busy voting for men. Why is that so? Ever realize that? So, what is the scope of gender-based violence in the country? Intimate partner violence, including acts of physical aggression, sexual coercion, psychological abuse, and controlling behavior in the context of marriage or other intimate relationship. There is rape and sexual assault as part of gender-based violence. There is sexual coercion and harassment. This is the scope of gender-based violence. Child marriages are happening in the context of gender-based violence, and some of these are kind of pushed by religious, ultra-conservative. Remember, yesterday I talked about the ultra-conservative and the conservative religious groups that then perpetuate child marriages. And then they marry off. Harmful practices, I talked about that, this girl pledging, widow cleansing. Have you ever heard about this? Yes, so there are and some shaking. There is widow cleansing. So this then happens once the man passes on, and then Bamnin is looked for, or someone close to the family, and then there are options to either inherit or service in quotations. So that's widow cleansing. And then forced inheritance. And I talked about trafficking and sexual exploitations. But what are the consequences of gender-based violence? The impact of gender-based violence goes beyond individual short-term injury and disability to the gross domestic product. It's not just the physical pain. It's not just the emotional pain. It goes to the economic pain. It continues long after it has been perpetrated. It actually leaves a scar. At individual level, GBV often leads to the isolation and ostracism of survivors, and to longer-term health, social, and economic consequences. Do you know that if a child grows up in a family that has gender-based violence, that child, when he or she marries, will have gender-based violence in his family? Health effects include physical injuries, sexually transmitted illnesses, HIV infection, unwanted pregnancies, which may lead to abortion, and a range of mental disorders. The threat of violence often limits women's ability to negotiate for safer sex. So there are two sides of the coin. In as much as there is the emotional gender-based violence that can happen to men because of denial of conjugal rights, but at the same time, the flip side then becomes physical coercion to get those same rights, then can also lead to the women's inability to say, I want or I don't at this point in time. And that's the reason why the Western culture or the Western world is bringing the term around marital rape. Have you ever heard of marital rape? Mm-hmm. That's how it's coming into the discussion because of this discourse. Survivors are often traumatized, which hinders them from seeking reproductive health services as they are afraid of intimidation from family members and perpetrators. Without the right support, survivors may find themselves experiencing anxiety and depression. And this is due to demotivation, disempowerment, and demoralization. This one is also related to the stigma and discrimination discussion, specifically the stigma discussion. Economic effects shows that survivors experience a high financial burden through direct costs incurred by survivors to deal with the consequences of the violence. So, how do we prevent or how do we manage gender-based violence? we need to talk about gender-based violence. We need to continue such discussions, and thanks to this convention, this discussion is happening. But if you look at most of the other presentations, they equally lead to this discussion. So we need to continue with these conversations in our conferences and churches. But we need to engage congregants on how to prevent GBV and child marriages. That's very important. We need to build capacity on responding and encouraging reporting, most importantly, on GBV. There's a very serious punishment in Zimbabwe for GBV, but people don't want to report because they then go back and look at the consequences. And because, remember, GBV normally is perpetrated by those that are closer to you, as opposed to those that are outside. Sharing information on where to access appropriate services and service providers is really critical. The health facilities can also come in. Remember, suppose the GBV, sexual gender-based violence, and there is rape. Remember, the girl child who would have raped should quickly access services at their nearest facilities within 72 hours, right? So we equally need to report to churches, to police. We have trained pastors that can also provide counseling, as well as NGOs that provide counseling to facilitate. And equally as churches, we need to identify early those signs of gender-based violence. The roots, remember we talked about the root causes. Those root causes, the minute you start to see them, you need to identify them and start the counseling process as early as possible. Because if we don't identify early, then we are actually exacerbating the problem. In Matthew 5, verse 9 to 10 says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." So we have to be peacemakers. As we leave this place, it's important that we become peacemakers. And after this discussion, where are we in terms of this equation? As male and female, where are we in terms of equality? Are we equal? No. Is there equity? No. And what is our reality? I thank you. I'll end here.